Welcome to the module on the origin of conflict in capitalism. As we are referring to the concept of the capitalism, it is referred as one of the historical stages in the evolution of the society, where capitalism is one of the historical stages of the society where the means of production are mainly the factors of production, which are machinery, capital, and labor. This mode of production has been one of the consistent phenomena in any societal process of economic, social, and economic transformations. And among the classical founders of social science, conflict theory and its interlinkage with capitalism has been taken up by Karl Marx during the tenure of 1818 to 1883. Conflict theory has already emphasized on the role of the power struggles, and that is also responsible or instrumental for shaping the different groups in the society. So thereby the shaping of the society and its transformation has been one of the inevitable consequence of this capitalism, where the modes of production has been changing in a consistent manner. Moreover, from the ideas of the Karl Marx, the theory which is referred as the conflict theory also has been responsible for change in the economic dynamics, also with the political dynamics, and where a dominant group and a subordinate group coexist. So this coexistence of both the groups has been one of the original manifestations of this conflict theory. So thereby when we refer to the term of capitalism and freedom, we are basically referring to how the individual's willpower, the individual's consciousness, and also as a societal point of view, how these two terms are interlinked. And this brings us to the most important approach of freedom to be coincided with capitalism as one of the major ingredients of the conflict theory. So firstly, we want to emphasize what the capitalism wants to ensure or to promise. Capitalism promises to replace the coercion and the domination characteristic of alternative modes of production with the voluntary mutually beneficial exchange. So whenever we are referring to the exchange, it means that basically it is a transactions or any mode of twin effect that takes place between the two stakeholders, who is the dominant group and the subordinate group. And thereby the domination takes place across various other modes of production like land, labor, and capital. Capitalism has also empowered the workers both within the site of production and at the level of politics. This is very crucial because when we refer to the site of the production, we go by the class struggle and the class classification, and the level of politics referred to the refer of political economy, where these two major units are coexisting together. Marxism also implied that capitalism, like previous socio-economic systems, would inevitably produce internal tensions leading to destructions. So these internal tensions are basically related with violence, basically related with the willpower and also the power struggle, which may lead to the destruction of a society before any reconstructive mode. And that is how capitalism plays an important role. Marx's theory of history also says that the class conflict is decisive. This is because whenever a class conflict comes up, then the consequence of the class conflict is the generation of an economic system whereby the two hierarchies coexist. One is capitalism and one is feudalism. So these two are the major sectors which actually emerge from any kind of consequence of the class conflict. This also goes back to the discussions on how conflict and capitalism are interconnected. This basically refers to one of the primary concern of any developed society, whereby the capitalism is basically being reflected with the conflict in its mature stage. So class conflict is seen to occur primarily between the bourgeois and the proletariat, that is the capital owners and the working class, and how this basically comes up as a never-ending process. So it takes the form of the conflict under various socio-economic indicators. Also the economic parameters are involved. Like the conflict can take place over hours of work. This basically refers to any form of exploitative practices where the overtime or any kind of insecure wage or any kind of exploitative practice in the wage structure, this also comes up as a mode of the conflict. Value of the wages is about the wage disparity, whereby Marx has stressed on the surplus value theory where the wage determination takes place. Division of profits also plays a very important role in terms of the rent-seeking behavior of the capitalist, how the profits can be distributed among the different stakeholders. Cost of consumer goods also play an important role because thereby the price discrimination takes place because of lack of information among all the members of the society. And that is asymmetric information, which is one of the inevitable consequence of any capitalistic society. The culture at work, which may be dominated by the capital owners, control over parliament or bureaucracy, and economic inequality. So all these factors are actually pointing out the degrees of discrimination or the degrees of disparity which occurs among different stakeholders, starting from the working class, and also we go by the capitalist classes. So in the prospect or as a response by the state can go for implementing certain programs which may seem to be purely humanitarian but can be form of a class conflict. Even when the state intervenes and goes for any kind of programs to eliminate or to mitigate this class conflict, that also results a kind of a inclusion and exclusion error. Because the people who are bound to get the benefit are excluded, and those are included within the government dole or any kind of kind transfer or cash transfer programs, they are not meant to be. So as a result, we can see that conflicts actually originate at the basis of capitalism, and even state intervenes to mitigate any form of conflicts that also results in some kind of discrimination. So nevertheless, we can say that the capitalists dominate the workers if and only if they have arbitrary power over the workers. So basically, it is the power struggle which makes the capitalists to dominate over the working class in terms of various parameters. Moreover, we can take up the issue from the political dynamics. It is said that capitalists also have power politically, and where you can see the political power is dominating to a certain extent. Capitalists have actually owners, or they have some kind of powers over different forms of production, and so that they need not to sell their labor or power to live or live well, but to hire workers using this means of production. So basically hiring workers, providing them the wages, and thereby makes them to enjoy the social cost and the surplus that is being generated. So any kind of social cost that is imposed on the society may be because of the practices which are done by the capitalist classes, and also makes the conflict to originate. So workers, by contrast, are those people who lack sufficient ownership. And this calls for the property right. This calls for the ownership right which the workers do not possess. And as a result of that, they have to sell their labor to the buyers of the labor, and thereby the selling of their labor to them makes them at the back end. That means they're worse off. So it is basically because of the discrimination that occurs between the workers and the capitalists that makes the conflict to take up a bigger shape and get pronounced in the society, particularly for the long run. So moreover, we can say that this origin of conflict and the capitalism are actually dominating each other. So whenever the origin of conflict is to be explored in further details, the first aspect that comes in where the capitalists dominate, and thereby the conflict becomes more and more pronounced. So at the very beginning, we start with the interest of the workers and how the interest of the workers actually differ from the interest of the capitalist classes. So firstly, workers have an interest in being free from the surveillance. This is because workers actually survive in a free world where they have nothing to own but basically to sell their labor. So they are not actually bound to follow any kind of rules or legislations or any kind of monitoring. And that is how workers are actually supplying their effort in order to get some kind of subsistence for the survival. Capitalists have an interest in spending part of the surplus on their luxury consumption. Because capitalists are basically profit motives, so they always have the tendency to extract the surplus so that they can actually spend it on their personal consumption expenses, and that is their lookout. So from the very beginning, they want to extract the economic surpluses like consumer surplus or producer surplus and imposing a social cost in the society. So capitalists, but not their workers, have an interest in using the lowest cost production techniques. This is highly pronounced in any globalized economy also, wherever the low cost of production actually makes the capitalist countries or the capitalist economies to actually delve into and enjoy the comparative advantage. This occurs with the entry of the giant MNCs to any developing economies which have a pool of surplus labor where the cost of employing them is very less. So even if this means moving operations to India, slashing jobs, dumping waste in workers' communities, etc. So these are some of the examples which are cited where they actually wants to penetrate into any less developed or developing economy and thereby wants to actually exercise their control over the social capital, over the basic infrastructure, and thereby utilize at their own means. So capitalists, but not their workers, have interest in producing whatever they will fetch the higher profits. Basically, this rent-seeking behavior is an inherent integral part of this process of capitalism, which also makes the conflict to be more and more pronounced and originating. Even it actually hurts the human needs. Basically, the domestic producers can be washed away. It can also affect the demand-supply forces. The price instability may come up. But despite all these disadvantages, the objective of the capitalist is to actually fetch for more profits by enjoying the comparative advantage. So this also goes into saying that capitalists want lower wage and workers want higher wage. And that is the source of conflict or discrimination. So in any economic modeling which is governed by the forces of demand and supply, an equilibrating wage is being determined. But that equilibrating wage is a market clearing wage which may not be satisfactory from the capitalist point of view, because capitalists always want to adopt any cost reduction strategy whereby the wages can be lowered and the workers actually wants to maximize their welfare by the higher wages which they demand. And this calls for the intervention of the trade unions which bargain for the higher wage. And that is how the industrial disputes and the conflict takes place whenever the capitalists try to dominate. Capitalists want to maximize work intensity effort and workers do not. Because the work intensity or basically the working hours are basically measured in terms of the labor hours and thereby the payment is being done and thereby the capitalists want to maximize. They want to choose always a profit maximizing model where the labor should be engaged and thereby the effort can be calculated in terms of hours. And capitalists have interest in choosing the level of monitoring and maximizing the work intensity and thus the profits. So that means more of labor and less of leisure is one of the motto of the capitalists to work in a profit maximizing environment, but the workers' interests actually differ at every point of time, which originates the conflict to come up. It is also said that capitalists do not minimize wage, but they maximize work intensity, and they are also ready to relocate their positions to any part of the globe. Capitalists also do not resolve any operational strategic conflicts in profit maximizing ways, do not long remain capitalists. That means any kind of strategic or operational conflict they want to minimize so that it does not affect their profit maximizing incentive. So individual capitalists lack real discretion over these issues. These are taken up in a global manner, in a collective manner. So more importantly, capitalists economize on their wage bill, increase the work intensity, and also to be replaced by a different capitalist more willing and able to do which the laws of capital command. So according to the laws of capital, the most important objective is to maximize the work intensity. Actually, they go for a lower cost of production, but the workers are actually demanding higher wage, and thereby the origin of conflict takes place when at workplace the capitalists actually dominate the workers and thereby the domination becomes more prevalent. This also goes on to saying that capitalists also use their power over workers from ends unrelated to that power's underlying economic rationale. Economic rationale in the sense because it can be socially optimum, but they go for only economic optimizing behavior where they maximize profit. And as a result of that, they want to go for multiple paths in order to reach their goal. So economic considerations might dictate layoff, but leave open which workers get the sack. That means workers may be also terminated from their job if they do not perform. And this is how the capitalists actually work on in a market-oriented framework. Cost must be cut, but there are many ways to do this because that is how they go for cut down in the salaries or any kind of perks. So any such kind of cost reduction mechanism is one of the practices which capitalists adopt in order to maximize their profit. So economic rationality does not fully determine this choice. Capitalist has the real discretion. So in most of the times, economic rationality may say the demand and supply must be same, but capitalists also intervene and actually exercise their discretionary role in maximizing the profit to a greater extent. So actually in all these dynamics we can see that in case of the capitalist in the society this occurs. Here we consider the origin of conflict and capital dominance in the arena of politics. The earlier discussions were in the framework of economics, where we find out profit maximization is one of the driving force, and that has been responsible for making the conflict to be more pronounced between the capitalist and the working classes. Here we refer in the domain of politics. So we say that the central issue at stake is that the political conflict concerns the country's laws, policies, and regulations. This is very much apt in a developed country or in advanced economy where all these legislations, law and policies mainly favor the capitalist who exercise their discretionary power over the working class. So in what effect the rules of game favor one class over the other. And this basically refers to a strategic play where we go for a zero-sum game in most of the cases, but in most of the cases we find that capitalists dominate the working classes. So capitalists usually have the social power to get their way in terms of various patronages they enjoy over bureaucracy and political domain. And also it is very much worse off for the workers because the interest of the capitalist and the workers always have a trade-off or always are a tussle. So the laws of capital are largely responsible for producing the antagonism between the capitalist and their workers, where the laws of capital are not only the economic laws, but also the social laws, the governance laws, and the laws of politics that comes in. This also brings down that the capitalists do not fire workers, drive down wages, but rather because these things are required by the logic of capitalist competition. So it is said that capitalists are not individually doing that, but because of the laws of capital, whenever there is excess demand or excess supply, it is because of the market forces that the wages equilibrate each other and the wages actually move, and this actually makes the workers to be worse off at certain stages. So it is said that the capitalists are basically governed by the market forces. Capitalists also control the bulk of the social surplus. So whatever surplus is generated within the society, capitalists hold an ownership over it, and that is either in terms of finance, either in terms of investment, which have a tendency to get largely privatized. And this privatization of the surplus also creates the source of the monopoly which the capitalists used to enjoy. So in most of the cases, it also prevents the government to come up any kind of revolutionary policy or by threatening to shift investment funds elsewhere. So this is very much observed in any developed country, or whenever the MNC wants to penetrate into any developing country or emerging economy, it is said that the host country government did not do much because there is always threat that capital can fly from that country to the other, and this may refer to the capital outflow. So as a result of the vested interest of the host country government, it is said that the capitalists continue to stay and exercise their discretionary power over the economic and the investment climate in terms of finance and investment flows. So now we get back to the most important issue that comes in the origin of conflict, that is on the Karl Marx and capitalism. It is said by the Karl Marx and capitalism theory that the social conflict theory focuses mainly on the competitive, which is domain within the laws of capital as discussed, and unequal aspects of the social life, because in terms of the power or in terms of the acquisition over social capital, which is absolutely a disparity between different stakeholders of the society, and how it generates social change and conflict. So Karl Marx has pointed out on two important ideas, one from a competitive point of view, where the laws of capital govern, and on the other on the bulk of the surplus that the capitalists used to enjoy their power. Marx offered a theory of capitalism based on his idea that human beings are productive, and in terms of productivity he means to survive, people have to work. So it is basically the working class who have to struggle for their subsistence and for their survival at the mercy of the capitalist. Marx also believed that the people have two relationships with the means of production. Either the productive property has to be owned or they have to work for someone else. So two categories are clearly identified by Marx, that is the working class who are basically working for someone else, and another category who are owning over the means of production. And this has been one of the two pillars of any kind of capitalism or conflict that originates. This boils down to a macro-oriented paradigm where the social conflict theory is deep-rooted. So social conflict theory is a macro-oriented paradigm in sociology, which is also there in political science and in other disciplines, where society is an arena of inequality that generates conflict and social change. Because these stakeholders are actually the members of the society, so within the societal transformation, this inequality originates. So the key elements in this perspective is that the structured ways where few are actually enjoying the majority of the wealth. And that is the concentration of wealth in the hands of few, where the distribution of income becomes bimodal. Because when we refer to the mode, we refer to the largest frequency. Bimodal means two or multiple peaks can come up in the wealth creation. And where the factors like race, gender, class, age, all are linked to this social inequality. So in terms of the social conflict, it is basically a conflict between the dominant group and the minority ones, and thereby the social conflict theory is deep-rooted within the propositions of Karl Marx. This also makes clear that capitalism also leads to the feelings of alienation for the workers, because this is a kind of a mistrust or a kind of a pessimistic view that falls on the owning class of the capitalist classes. Because this is an experience of isolation, which is alienation, and misery that results from the feeling of powerlessness. So whenever a supreme power authoritates or dominates the working class is always at the mercy. So some kind of isolation and some kind of alienation comes in, which is deep-rooted in the theory of deprivation, which is taken up by the economic discipline. The only way to avoid is to reorganize society. So society needs to be reorganized in such a way which can be a hypothetical structure of economic production where all the needs can be addressed together, and then only the equitable distribution can come up. So Marx has also focused on the class conflict, which says that industrial capitalism benefited the few at the expense of many. So always it is said that the expenses of many means the exploitation or the deprivation is at large. So this also boils down that how can we come up with the discussion of the Karl Marx and the conflict theory. Because in the discussion of the conflict theory, which is actually one of the byproduct of the Marxian capitalism theory, says that this is because of competition over the limited resources. And thereby the same resource has to be taken up by all the stakeholders, where the capitalists own the majority and the working class have to take up the byproduct or the consequences. So where the society, where the competition occurs for limited resources, and between the two groups where one group exercises full power and another group is absolutely powerless. So society is being made up of individuals in different social classes, and they compete for social, material and political resources. So this competition is a never-ending process in terms of employment, in terms of housing, in terms of education, and many other facets as it's seen. So some institutions come up in order to intervene, to mitigate the inequalities, but actually in the ultimate end, there is nothing much done to address the disparity, because the disparity remains as it is despite the effort of the state or the government. So this basically refers to one of the major issues, that how class conflict and capitalism can be intensified. Intensification means moderating the degree of the conflict between the two. So this brings down to the discussions on intensification. So under capitalism, it is said that the producers, which are mainly the owners or the capitalist classes, and the proletariat, mainly the working class, are legally free. So being neither attached to the land nor any particular factory. So it is said that if we want to moderate this conflict, then we have to make that they can operate on their own without any kind of linkages or without any kind of legislations or restrictions. Possessing no means of production, they are compelled to sell their labor power and thereby come under the yoke of exploitation. And due to this, the free laborers become conscious of their class interest and organize themselves in a working class environment. So whenever the free labor comes up for a longer period of time, they actually recognize that labor cannot be generated freely, and then they start bargaining for returns or wages. So this is working class environment, which starts at the beginning in terms of free labor, gets intensified into the working struggle, bargain for better wage, and culminates into a class conflict, and that is how the capitalist system is reflecting its manifestations. Marx also said that capitalist system symbolizes the most acute form of inequality, exploitation, and class antagonism, and this calls for a socialistic revolution, or that is how leads to a new stage of society called communism. So that means the origin of the communism is deep rooted in the social conflict theory, which is propagated by Karl Marx. So in this particular module, we actually delve into how the concept of capitalism is basically giving rise to the concept of conflict. That is the origin of conflict within the purview of capitalism. Secondly, the conflict issues are widely discussed in the arena of dominance, either in an economic framework, which is largely driven by profit maximizing principle, or in terms of political framework, where they actually own the bulk of the economic surplus and thereby they exercise power. So two categories are identified. One is having power and another is without power, and how this conflict becomes a never-ending process. The conflict theory also says that inequality, alienation, and all kind of disparities are one of the consequences of the capitalist mode, and that is how Karl Marx have said, which actually gives rise to new stage of theory or communism. And thereby the concept of class and class struggle comes in, and whereby the origin of conflict becomes deep-rooted. Hence, capitalism and conflict are interlinked with each other, which calls for proper state intervention.